I've structured my presentation on three parts. The first one is the bigger theme of patient engagement, where this is going, and then I'll come down to alliances. What we're doing today, what the standard is today, and my crystal ball for 2030. And I know this meeting is not just about rare diseases, but I come from the rare disease work, so a lot of my thinking is around rare diseases. We also lead a lot of the advocacy, comes from the rare disease community, and in particular the examples I'm going to be showing are from what we've been doing in CDKL5 deficiency. Philip was talking about that. In my position, I'm still with them, with the Loulou Foundation. I just don't have the complicated titles. So let's start where patient engagement is going, and it's actually going where the whole planet is going towards 2030, and that's towards decentralization. We used to consume knowledge coming from authoritative sources, I guess that's the word in English, one way, and now a lot of it is bottom-up, user-generated, and we don't have to compromise on quality, which is usually the pushback to make this change, that it would be bad. We're seeing that also now with Web3. Everybody's talking about Web3. What this means is that at the beginning, we also used to just have something to read and consume that content. Now we're in a second phase where everybody contributes. This is the time of social media. But we still have the big middleman. This is Facebook, this is YouTube. Web3 is remove the middleman, and now is true user empowerment and central role. And just like all of these trends, I think that's where drug development is going. User empowerment and central role, and in this case, that's the patient community. And we're already seeing that in many aspects. So we're already seeing how regulators, and we saw that, involve the patient voice earlier and earlier, and more importantly, we're also seeing more decentralized clinical trials, making things easier and more convenient to the participants. We also have the patient input to the industry, also from very early, and the bigger importance now of real-world evidence and patient-reported outcomes. We see, and this is unquestionable, the thought leadership of patient groups and patient organizations. And the most extreme case that I'm seeing coming from the rare disease community is this N of 1 trials or N of few, where the patient groups can generate the therapy and bring it to trials and completely skip pharma. That's the one where you even skip the middleman. So I think that's where the field is going. That boat have left, or that train, whatever it's said, that's where everything is going. Now let's talk about alliances. One thing that we said before is this change in mindset of what patient centricity means, from building for patients to building with patients. I think this change has happened. We see it everywhere. The implementation might be a bit tricky sometimes, but this has happened. But my experience this decade working within the patient groups, a lot of the work still comes from us. So all of the big stories of partnerships were led and mainly pushed from the patient side. So that's something still needs to catch up. And as in everything, as I was saying, this trend towards putting the user at the center, today it would be stupid to build, in this case, medicine without involving the user. And it's not something that we have to do just because it's the nice thing, but really, patient organizations today, the ones I work with, which are focused on research, can do so much that they could almost advance everything without pharma, that it would be stupid to not work with them. I'm going to give you here some examples, and this part is quick, of things that we've built. In this case, I'm going to be using examples from CDKL5 to solve all of the blocks that you need to put in place in order to be able to develop a therapy. You need to have some understanding on the early biology, and we do that through funding, so bringing together the scientists, kind of capturing them and enabling all the basic science. We also invest a lot on solving preclinical research by creating all of the tools that are needed, making them high quality, open access, even funding the key questions, like what's the therapeutic window, at which age we need to act, which is the key cell that needs this, what are the targets of this protein, we fund all that. Clinical development, same thing. We build the international registries available in many languages. Clinical outcome research. Do we know how to measure a drug in a clinical trial for this disease? We do all that. We get to regulators. And you were saying before, Cecilia, FDA actually has really good mechanisms like patient-focused drug development meetings. Make sure that information is out there. They understand the disease, and they understand how patients see the benefit risk, and they'll be able to judge those treatments accordingly. We also work at preparing that patient community, make sure they're well educated in what is the clinical trial, why we need placebo. crowdsourcing, bottom up the list of their favorite trial sites. So now we have a global trial site network, the one that the patients chose. All of that we could do. If you're a pharma company, you just need to plug your drug into the system. That's why it's so important, the role. It's not just the knowledge of the disease, but the essential drug discovery and development role that many patient organizations are doing. But the example that they asked me to bring here today is this massive community alliance, community-driven alliance, that I had the pleasure and pain to lead, and that started not knowing what it was going to be. It started 2 years before, and that was with a very reasonable question, which was, can we come up with a list of outcome measures for this disease? Let me tell you, the disease is neurological, it's very complex. All of the systems are involved, it has many symptoms, and as the field prepares for gene therapies, it's really complex to know what to measure. So we brought in a room for a one-day workshop. People from at that time there were 5 companies working on the space, so all of the pharma companies that were working on the disease, we asked them to send someone from clinical development and from regulatory, and let's discuss what are the best outcome measures. We also have clinicians in the room, patient representatives, experts in specific domains like psychology, motor. It was going to be one-day workshop. We're going to go on our way with our favorite list of outcomes. It turned out to be more complex. As the companies explain us, we don't know the good outcome measures until we run studies, and that's why we're planning to run an observational study. And me too, and me too, and me too. 5 observational studies that we're planning. So by lunch break, we decided to change the agenda and ask them, okay, how could we run only one? Could we just do one? With all of you, 5 different companies, we'll help coordinate that. How would that work? And the reason this took so long is that there was no precedent at that scale for something like this, and there was a very important mental barrier. It turns out that this type of clinical research in outcome measures is past that line from pre-competitive to competitive. For companies, collecting that data that will help them get outcome measures, biomarkers, even the relationship with the trial sites is competitive. They didn't want to do that together. Now we have a community to take care of. We don't want 5 studies. And in the end there were 7 companies, so 7 studies in a rare disease. And we had to do many things to change this, because at the end, obviously, this is the story of a success story. And one of the big one was to put pressure on them, like, look how bad this would look if we don't do this, if you go separated. And for that, we enlisted the FDA. So we brought the plan for the study to FDA, and they not only endorsed the science part, they really, really insisted that it was so important that it would be run by all of the companies together. They said, we don't want you to come here with a different proposal from a different data set. If you could have been part of this, we want to have the same data. And that helped a lot. Second difficulty was logistics. We were a foundation with 1.5 employees. I was a half. And we had now promised that we were going to run a study the size of a phase 3 with the standards of a phase 3 on behalf of all these companies, because they wouldn't trust one company to lead it. It had to be us. So we had to change, and we had to hire, and we had to bring on board a CRO that we had to select, and we didn't know how to do that. We had to hire clinical operations, clinical development, a bunch of lawyers. All these companies have lawyers. But then we were not 5 companies, there were 7, more lawyers. And we wanted to bring everybody on board. By then it was a bit easier, this pressure, because if the study is going to happen with 4 or 5, you don't want to be the one company that goes alone. It's really going to look bad. So we made it. And essentially we redefined what pre-competitive is. And today that study is running, and it has 7 companies. It's run by us in collaboration with the International Patient Alliance. And it has very valuable objectives. It's going to validate the outcome measures, so that's going to help us design the trials that those companies are going to run. It's so well done, it's like a mock clinical trial, same standards, so we hope to use that as a natural history cohort as well, the trial network and everything. And essentially this is an example of how we could redefine what is pre-competitive. It wasn't, but now it is pre-competitive in our space to do this by creating so much value for us in the patient community, but also to the companies, so much that they put the money. This is more than 10 million. We could not have done this without pharma. This is a proof of concept. Wouldn't it be good if this is how things were done and we didn't have companies doing competing clinical studies and patients having to give their data over and over and over? Yeah, that's the crystal ball. So here's how I think things are going to be different by 2030. I thought about this. I think there are 3 key things that should change. I'm going to say that are going to change. Let's pretend this happened. First thing, by 2030, patient organizations are a lot more professionalized. It's not just about the expertise of patients. They have professionals. And for that, it needs to be a viable career and a viable job. So far, this is a lot of volunteer, extra time, and that doesn't scale. For this to happen, the patient organizations will not be regarded as charities. They will be an essential player in drug discovery and development, and we saw that in all of your slides, but this has to be backed up by infrastructure and funding and everything. And I think this type of project-based funding coming from the industry, given that we're building all that value for the industry, is the way that this could happen. And this is professionalization, what a word, inside. The second thing I think is going to change is professionalization around entities like a Medicom that is bilingual in knowing what the pharma needs, but also what the patients need, and can connect those 2 worlds as an ecosystem so that patient organizations can really do more without having to build it in-house. This is like CROs for biotechs. I can run a biotech because there are tons of CROs to do the research. Otherwise, only big pharma could do it. Same thing, but for patients. And these are some examples, and you guys changed the logo and the tagline. So they changed it. But there are already examples of this type of organization, and this is what will support that decentralization, where patient organizations can do so much more. They can't just build everything in-house, but there are examples around clinical data, around preclinical work, around partnerships. The third thing that needs to change, and this one has to really happen, it's a social contract that will make it hard for pharma to not come early and help build a field. Essentially, what we did, moving this pre-competitive, you have to come and help us build the data that will enable all of the projects, will become like the ticket to be able to play in the space. It will not be okay to wait and compete and expect the patient organizations to fix everything and then you come at the end. It should be like a social contract. And to give you an example of that, here's a tweet from a year ago from the organization of a friend of mine in the States, that's another neurological rare disease, about COVID. And they said, imagine if the first 100 people diagnosed with COVID were told, oh wow, that's unfortunate, why don't you come up with the money and convince enough scientists or pharmaceutical companies to study this unknown disease with no treatment and make sure you work fast enough, because there are millions of other lives now in the future that are counting on you. We're doing this to the patient groups. They have to solve it, they have to find the money, they have to find the research. And now we look at this for COVID and we know it's not okay. The pharma industry, we knew we could do better, and that we had to do. That's our role in society. So by 2030, I think that we'll reach more than just COVID, and we'll take care of a lot of these diseases. And that by 2030, and that's my last slide, the patient will truly be at the center of drug discovery and development, supported by those 3 things: more professionalized groups, this ecosystem of bilingual organizations around that will enable this work to happen, and a societal contract that will say it's not okay to make them have to fix everything before we plug the drugs into the system. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. Great talk. So, also going back to the previous speaker, what I've come across in doing research in rare diseases, and I'm sure this is also very familiar to you, in regards to real-world data and registries, that in several rare diseases there are like 5 different registries across the globe, all collecting slightly different data, but also a lot of the same stuff. Do you know of any initiatives to kind of force companies and organizations to pool that data and give access to the scientific community to that data, instead of everyone keeping the data for themselves?
At least the placebo arm.
Yeah.
No, but that's a good question. So the danger of that is the incentive. So registries that are started by hospitals, for example, sometimes they wanted to advance their own professional career, so data is valuable for them, and that's an incentive to share openly that data. But I've even seen in the patient community that starting a registry is a way to monetize that data, and they all need money. So if there was money, we could create a central one, and that seems to be the way to work because the ones that are more bottom-up created are serving those incentives, which are understandable, and that is a phenomenon that happens a lot. The best we've managed to do in CDKL5 is to work with GUIDs, this global unique identifier, which is like a code that allows you to then share data without breaking, so that at least someone could aggregate that and we can make it interoperative, and at least the patient doesn't have to give the same data to 3, they can just tell you, go in and connect, but connect, not have one. We haven't managed to get there. We have one registry, but there are more.
I was wondering, you were talking about social contracts and here we are talking about sharing data. Would it be an idea to make a kind of index to really push the pharma to get up in the list, like we have for access to medicine? Do you think that's a good idea? I think like the access to medicine works like that. It was triggered by that companies should be giving their medicines available to third world countries. So they are scored now, and this scoring, this access to medicine, really has an impact on their shared value on the stock market. So, but at the end, it's always about the money, as you said. So somehow we should force or give an incentive to the pharmaceutical industry to work like a social contract and to share the data for rare diseases.
Yes, and I think that's what Nicola was explaining with some of the projects, where to quantify. If you don't measure something, it's hard to do and get credit for it. So that is a good idea, to breach that and be able to quantify who's playing fair and playing that social contract. Yes, I don't know if the stock market will reward them for that, though.
At the end they will. It's like social responsible entrepreneurship that they are also scored, and of course there are a lot of criteria and a lot of remarks, and but at the end I think it's worthwhile to investigate.
Thank you.